Hello, my name is Alexander Mattes, and I'm the course director of the Cajal course on modern approaches to behavioral analysis. It's my great pleasure to introduce Nicky Clayton from the University of Cambridge as a keynote speaker to this course. Professor Clayton is well known for her study of the development and evolution of cognition in corvids, and she has won many awards for this work, and most notably is a fellow of the Royal Society. So with that very short introduction, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Professor Clayton, who will tell us about comparative cognition today.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I've entitled this lecture Comparative Cognition. And what I mean by comparative is really in two ways. In psychology, people use the word comparative to mean a comparison between humans and other non-human animals. In zoology, the discipline I was trained in originally, we use comparative to mean making comparisons between many species, not just humans, and often not even including humans. Now, in my talk, I'm going to do a mixture of both. I'm going to compare the corvids with human beings, but I'm also going to compare the corvids with other species. And I suppose the key question in this analysis is, how do we use behavior to investigate new ways of seeing and thinking? How do we use behavior to explore cognition in the absence of language? Thought we can debate exactly what language is, but I think we could all agree that no animal other than human beings can read and write. So I suppose the first question is, what do we mean by behavior? And for me, that's just about the movements and mannerisms exhibited by the species in question. Now, how do we observe and describe behavior? Well, probably I think most of my inspiration has come from the ethologists that won a Nobel Prize in studying animal behavior. And Konrad Lorenz famously said, "Know thine animal," meaning that you have to dedicate a lot of time to simply observing and describing their behavior. Konrad Lorenz was an inspiration in that regard, but so was Nico Tinbergen, who was absolutely fantastic at knowing how to not only describe but quantify behavior, and really led the initial development in thinking about how to conduct experiments to provide more information about the behavior that the animal was undertaking. Another question is, what insights can we provide for training behavioral observations while engaging comparatively in studying cognition? And I suppose for me, these are such general questions that have inspired all the work that I've done, as well as thinking about the potential use of models, which you'll hear about later in the course, such as deep cut learning, which is a software package for animal pose estimation, or machine learning artificial intelligence models. So I'm going to really focus my talk on one particular example and kind of keep trying to bring it back to some of these key questions. Now, the example I'm going to start with is the caching behavior of corvids. Now, by corvids, I mean members of the crow family that include the ravens, the rooks, the magpies, and the various species of jays. And in fact, I'm going to focus on two species. Sorry, is that all right?
Yes, yeah, it's perfect. I was just wondering if the slides actually update, and they do. So let's keep going.
Perfect. So the two kinds of jays, these are different species of jays that I'm going to be focusing on, are the Eurasian jay pictured on your left and the Californian scrub jay pictured on your right. So the Eurasian jays are found in Europe and Asia, and the Californian scrub jays are found in America and Mexico, not just in California, despite their name. And I've called it magic mind because I mentioned at the beginning that one of the problems of investigating cognition is that in animals that are not human beings, we have to rely totally on behavior. We can't use language. And one of the recent tools of the trade that I've been adopting is using magic effects. In other words, investigating the psychology and biology of cognitive illusions. Why? Because they don't rely on having to use verbal report, and therefore we don't have to worry about the language issue. Another reason for why is that we can look not just at how good animals are in their computation of cognition, but also the constraints on their ability to see, to remember and think. I usually refer to such things as blind spots in seeing and roadblocks in thinking. So that's my second answer to the why question. And I have a third answer why use magic effects. And my third answer is based on something very important in my psyche, which is that when studying the behavior of an animal, it's really important to find something that's natural, something that they do for a living. And one thing that corvids, such as the Eurasian jay pictured on the left and the Californian scrub jay pictured on the right, do for a living, what Americans call 24/7, meaning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is that they cache food. They hide it, often burying it and putting a leaf over it or a stone over it. And they have absolutely amazing memories of where they've stashed those caches of hidden food. They can remember what they've cached, where and how long ago, and who's watching. And they're really good at anticipating the future, of planning for when to recover their caches and from where, based on who was watching and how long ago. So it's a lovely integration of a naturalistic system, caching behavior, which can be explored using the psychology and biology of magic effects, of cognitive illusions. Now, one of the reasons why this interests me so much is because a fundamental feature of cognition in human beings is that actually our perceptions, our ability to reminisce on what we think we saw, and our memories, our abilities to reminisce on what we think happened, are subjective in nature. In fact, after this talk, each and every one of you will have a slightly different memory of what actually happened, even if you watch the recording multiple times. And I just want to give you a classic example of the subjective nature of memory and perception. And this is actually a very old, but very short, black and white movie clip that was made by the Guardian newspaper called Points of View.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
So that was an advert made by the Guardian newspaper in the early 1980s to suggest that the Guardian newspaper was extremely objective in its analysis, but that as human beings we're extremely subjective. So of course that's one thing we have to bear in mind when we're studying behaviour, that we need to make sure that despite the natural subjective nature of our experiences and the way we see and the way we remember, we're trying to, as scientists, observe things objectively and measure things objectively. So that's the sort of first conundrum. And I think magic is a really powerful example of this. Another example, if you're interested in finding out more about it, is to have a Google Daniel Simons and look for the monkey business illusion, which is an excellent example of change blindness. I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is because I'll spoil the effect the first time you watch it, but I'm happy to address questions about it afterwards once you've watched it. Okay, so I'm not going to show it to you now. That's just a little bit of optional homework should you wish to see it, but it's a very powerful example of just how subjective our ability to see and remember is. And in fact, my favorite quote about memory is, you don't remember what happened. What you remember becomes what happened. So I want you to bear that in mind in your course about observing behaviours and how to analyse them. And it's why it's so important to have models such as deep cut learning and machine learning AI models in order to ground your behaviours in some kind of objectivity. The other way, of course, you can do it is simply video record your animals behaving so that you can have multiple human experimenters observing the behaviour in question, and you can make sure then that you have developed some sort of reliability index of how accurate you've seen something versus someone else. So those are issues really about why these sorts of techniques are so important. So returning now to the magic, I've suggested in a recent paper published in Science, along with my PhD student Elias Garcia Pellegrin, postdoc Alexandra Schnell, and Tango partner and artist in residence Clive Wilkins, who's also a member of the Magic Circle, that experiments with magic effects might be really informative about cognition in animals, because we can ask what animals find surprising in a way that doesn't rely on verbal report. Now, essentially, to distill it all down to the very basics, and then I'm going to show you a video with examples, is that magic capitalizes on the fact that what we see and what we remember is subjective. We then anticipate what we expect to see, and we have to have some causal understanding of what we expect and what we don't expect. And then the magician can use those expectations of what we think we will see based on what we thought we saw and remembered, and violate that expectation, and that's what delivers the surprise. So I'm going to, in the first part of my talk, I'm going to talk about the natural behaviours of the jays and how this caching behaviour is relevant to magic. And then I'm going to come on to talking about how we can use magic effects in human beings to explore these blind spots in seeing and roadblocks in thinking in animals in general, not just human beings. And in terms of comparative analysis, I'll be first looking at jays, and then I'll be turning to monkeys. I'm not going to explain why now, but I will explain a little bit further on in the talk. So on this slide, you can see some of the cache protection tactics that the birds use. So the problem with hiding food is that it's great if you're the one that recovers it at a later date, but others observe you caching and could steal it. And the consequence of which is that the jays go to great lengths to protect their hidden stashes of food, their caches, from being stolen by other birds, using things like shade and barriers and distance, and moving them around multiple times, a bit like the cup and ball effect that magicians use. And in truth, magicians use all of these tactics when performing effects for human beings too. They position themselves carefully so that you only get a particular view that they want you to see. They also are very keen on the lighting conditions, such as using shade, and degrading information using distance. Perhaps the most dramatic example for me of the work that we've done on cache protection tactics is the one shown on this slide, in which the birds move caches when they come to recover them after the potential pilferers, pilfering simply means the birds that might steal their caches, have left the scene. And the dramatic effect was that it depends on experience. So experienced thieves who have stolen other birds' caches in the past, in other words, they've been pilferers themselves, move the caches to new places, but only if they were observed, not if they cached in private. But naive birds who haven't had any experience of being thieves, of pilfering other birds' caches, don't do it. So this shows that it's not a hardwired strategy, but that it depends on the specific experience of having been a thief in the past. And it's therefore a good example of theory of mind, of putting yourself in another's shoes. Now, the interesting thing is that when they come to move their caches at recovery, there are two very distinct different behaviours. If they move the caches, or in other words, recache them in private, you can see the worms are fully visible in the beak. But if others are watching, you can't see what's going on really. You can tell stuff's being moved around, but it's a bit like the cup and balls game. You can't really see whether it was actually moved or not. And just like magicians, they have secret pockets, albeit in the case of a jay, a throat patch. So it seemed to me that this behaviour that the birds are doing, these cache protection tactics, have a number of parallels with what we see magicians doing when they go to hide their coins or lemons or whatever particular gadgets they're using at the time. And that led us to ask whether jays are sensitive to cognitive illusions in a series of papers in which we either had food hidden under cups or we actually had a human being transferring food from one hand to another and seeing whether they could keep track of where the birds had cached the food. Now, I make it sound simple, but I was so grateful to Elias Garcia Pellegrin, the lead author on this paper published in PNAS and the other one in Science, because actually he's an amateur magician, but a very good amateur magician. And actually, there's one thing being a magician hiding coins. There's quite another hiding a wriggly waxworm, which is the Belgian truffles of the jay world. It's their favourite food, but the worms wriggle and move around. So firstly, you have to be able to overcome any tickly feeling of the worm moving. And secondly, you have to be able to hide it in such a way that the worm is secure. I mean, hiding a coin is not easy, but a coin is an inanimate object. A worm is an animate object. It's a living thing, and that makes it even more tricky. What I'm going to show you now is a little video that appeared in the Christmas and New Year special issue of the New Scientist. And I'll start with, it'll have a little bit of some magic effects as done for human beings, then a little bit of interviewing of Clive and me and Eli talking, but you'll also see the way in which we presented some of these effects for the jays and the parallels between what we're doing with jays and the human beings.
Magic tricks are a fascinating window on our minds.
Indeed. Do I have anything behind my ear? I doubt it. Anything in my hand? Of course not, which means that this should be physically impossible.
They highlight gaps in our perception and attention, which magicians exploit to disguise what's in front of our eyes.
I suppose the coin would be just there. Thank you very much.
But what about other animals? Do they fall for the same tricks we do? Could their susceptibility to magic tricks highlight flaws in their perception? Or could an ability to be misled actually reveal kinds of intelligence we didn't know they had?
How did you become interested in doing magic tricks for animals?
Well, I've always wanted to be a bird. I've always wanted to fly.
and move around three-dimensionally and think like a bird. So that's how I got into science. But also through my passion for dance, I met Professor Clive Wilkins, who's artist in residence in the Department of Psychology, and he's a professional magician. And we both shared a great interest in memory and mental time travel through different perspectives, art and science.
I visited Cambridge University's Comparative Cognition Lab to see how the group are examining the mental abilities of jays using magic tricks.
Jays are extremely intelligent. We call them the feathered apes because they're on a cognitive par with the chimpanzees. And they're also very attentive. They really watch what you're doing. And so they became the perfect subject.
Elias Garcia Pellegrin spent months working with the birds in order to prepare for the experiments.
So one of the things that Eli was able to do was to train them to peck a thumb, to ask them which hand they thought concealed the object he'd hidden.
This trick is known as a French drop.
Good job, baby.
The jays don't fall for it, but perhaps that's not surprising. When humans watch the trick, we assume that the left hand is grasping the worm.
Your brain uses shortcuts when you perceive these movements. It just goes, well, what's the most likely thing to happen? Well, the most likely thing to happen is that when this hand grabs an object, the most likely thing is for a completed transfer to occur. And that's where magicians are very good, because they are very good at seeing how to make a movement which is perceptive so alike a real movement that the brain does not notice it. Even though there are particular kinematics that would tell you that this movement is fake, right? Like the tension. But you don't see that because you're just using the shortcuts in perception. However, birds don't need these expectations to survive because they do not have hands.
But the birds do fall for some other tricks.
Have a look. Where is it? Here. You're wrong. It's not.
On my visit, it wasn't just the birds being treated to a show.
Sam, do you remember the £10 note we talked about? Could I borrow it now?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Watch carefully.
When I watch this trick, I'm pleasantly surprised by the increase in my fortunes. But a similar trick was used to make the jays think their favourite snack had been replaced with a different one.
There's a £20 note.
Basically, what we did is that we showed Stuka the waxworm in this case. We pretended to deposit it inside the cup, and then we turned the cups around. Then Stuka went in and chose to retrieve the cup where she saw we put the waxworm in. But in doing so, she found that magically the waxworm had transformed into a mealworm. And then we measured how long it took Stuka here, or any of the birds that we tested, to actually ingest, to eat the worm, okay? And we found that when we did this case, a devalue condition, so their first preferred item magically transformed into their less preferred item, they took way longer than when we did an up value condition. So their less preferred item in this case transformed into their most preferred item. Think about the magic effect that Clive did for you. Okay, you were happy because a £10 note became a £20 note. That's great, right? But what if Clive takes your £10 note and transforms it into a £5 note? It's not that happy anymore, right? You're not that willing to take that £5 note anymore. You want to give it back. You want Clive to transform it into a £10 note again, don't you? That's what happened here.
Are you doing any magic experiments with any other animals besides scorpions?
We're hoping to do some magic effects with primates, and we're also excited about exploring some of these ideas with cephalopods, cuttlefish, octopus, squid.
You do get attached to these animals, especially when you spend a long time working with them. You notice their different personalities. Gone are the days of like scientists with white lab coats not having any feelings for their subjects. We've learned too much about what's going on in their minds to just treat them as just banal subjects. Because these are not banal subjects. These animals can think, they can feel, they understand the past, the present, and the future. And I don't see any point for me not to treat them as such, if this makes sense.
So I hope that put it in context for you. So let me explain a little bit about what we did with the jays, capitalizing on the fact that they cache food and how they like to be deceptive in the way in which they move their caches around so that their audience doesn't actually know the real location of the caches. And then I'll move on to our most recent work, which isn't yet published, but has been submitted for publication, which is on the monkeys.
Magic tricks.
So in terms of exploring the perceptual inabilities of jays using magic effects, as you saw in the video, what Elias pictured here did was to train the birds to hop onto a perch. It's also a weighing scale. That's a good way of being able to weigh them without having to catch them up. And then just pecking Eli's thumb as to which hand they think the worm is in. And there you see him. This is Stuka pecking Eli's left thumb to say, open up that hand for the worm. And we performed 3 kinds of effects pictured here. There's a palm transfer where the worm is swiftly secured between the fingers, appears to be transferred to the alternative hand, but retained in the initial hand. Then there's and then they're given which hand is it in, and you can mark whether it's, depending on whether it's the correct hand or the incorrect hand. The correct hand being the hand in which the worm is actually located. Similarly, for the French drop, you can see that in B, the middle panel, the thumb is concealed to give the illusion that the alternative hand will take hold of the worm, but actually the worm's dropped into the initial hand. And then the final one is the fast pass. Now note that with the fast pass, it doesn't require a finger and thumb action. It's much more swiftly passed from one hand to the other, but it doesn't require this kind of pincer grip action. And here you can see a palming technique. And Stuka got it correct. And then you can see the French drop technique. And finally, the fast pass technique. And you can see that she got the fast pass technique wrong. She was fooled by the magic effects. We, by the way, are fooled by all of them. And here you can see the J results. This is the percentage of correct responses. You can see the J's are pretty accurate at both the palm transfer and the French drop, but they're largely fooled, as in they have a very small percentage of correct responses for the fast pass. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like in terms of the humans. And this is just one example of the control. So here are the human results, and you can see that both for the palm transfer, the French drop, and the fast pass, the percentage of correct responses is very low. In other words, they're fooled by all three effects, unlike the Jays, who are only fooled by the fast pass effect. So we argued then that this is an unexpected audience, if you like, that these magic effects are a good way of looking at blind spots in seeing and roadblocks in thinking, in both humans, but also in other non-human animals. And in principle, you could do these effects in any animal that's visually minded, not just the Jays. Now, we were initially rather surprised that the Jays were only fooled by the fast pass effect. But then we thought, well, hang on a minute, could it be something to do with fingers and thumbs? Because obviously Jays don't have hands, but the fast pass effect, in a way, is based on the hands moving in a similar way to wings. It's just about transferring from one palm to another and obscuring the effect. It doesn't rely on any understanding of fingers and thumbs. So we then turned to monkeys, and we were particularly interested in looking at the marmosets, which have essentially their thumb is like a finger, they just have fingers, as opposed to other primates that have opposable thumbs, such as the capuchins. So this is a diagrammatic explanation of the effects that we performed on the monkeys. We had the precision grip, which depends on a finger of thumb, on fingers and thumbs, and our control was a power grip, which only relies on the fingers to do the manipulation. And we looked at the French drop versus the power drop. And what you see here is the their performances. And we looked at the capuchin monkeys that have opposable thumbs, the squirrel monkeys that have semi-opposable thumbs. They can't really grip the opposable thumb, but they do have a thumb that can be opposed. And therefore, we thought that the capuchin monkeys would be fooled by all the effects, just as human beings are, because they have proper opposable thumbs. We thought the squirrel monkeys might be fooled because they have a thumb that sort of opposes, but we wondered whether you actually needed to physically be able to do the gripping or not. And you can see that you don't. You can see that the squirrel monkeys behave like the capuchin monkeys. They are fooled, whereas the marmosets that only really have fingers are not fooled by the French drop effect. However, when we reenact it as a power drop, where you use just fingers rather than fingers and thumbs, they are fooled. So in the basic French drop condition, the marmosets that don't have opposable thumbs behave like the Jays. But when we reenact it to do a version that just requires fingers, the marmosets are indeed fooled by the effect. So it's a really nice example of embodied cognition, because what we're suggesting here is that actually having a hand with fingers and thumbs affects the interpretation you place on what you think you saw, what you think you remembered, and what you anticipate, what you expect. So that's why we think that this kind of comparative approach is so important. And in the New Scientist piece, we mentioned cephalopods. We haven't done any experiments with cephalopods yet, but we think that they would also be a very interesting species to consider, because what they're good at is avoiding becoming living lunch by using dynamic camouflage, by being able to change the way they look, how they are seen based on texture and colour. And that might also give us a window into looking at what they understand about their bodies and how the world works based on using an effect in magic called black art, in which you capitalise on the lighting conditions. So something that's black on a black background will appear invisible. So with that, I will finish and just say thank you so much to everyone for listening to me. So sorry I couldn't be there in person. And I'd just like to thank all my collaborators. So you can see Clive performing a magic effect next to me on the right-hand side of this picture. And you can see all the other members of my lab, my PhD students and postdocs in the photograph on the left. Thank you very much.